Catherine Early. I'm a PhD candidate at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio. So my interest in vertebrate paleontology actually started in undergrad because growing up I was always really interested in animals and what made them be the way they are and behave the way they are, interact with each other the way they do. And so I, growing up not in an academic setting, didn't really think about paleontology. I played with dinosaurs as a kid, but I wasn't here for the dinosaurs. I was into it for the animals. And I went to my undergraduate institution thinking I would go to veterinary school because it had an affiliated one. And then I tried that for a year of pre-vet classes and realized this was not the way I wanted to get at. It wasn't really answering questions about animals. It was answering the clinical questions, but I realized that my whole life thinking I wanted to work with animals and I had to be a vet to do it, maybe I was wrong.
Okay.
And I was fortunate enough to be at an institution that actually had some paleontology coursework. So I took an Introduction to Dinosaurs course my second year in undergraduate and really enjoyed it, really enjoyed how we were asking questions about animals. Granted, they were extinct animals, but it was still going at it in a way that really fit with what I'd wanted to do without realizing that that's what I wanted to do. So that's how I got to it a little bit. I wouldn't say non-traditional because I think that is a pretty common story, but I came to it just a tad bit later.
And maybe next you can tell us just a little bit about your research and what sort of contributions you've made to the field.
Yeah. So my research currently is on the evolution of the brains in birds, and I'm broadly interested in how behavior shapes the brain and shapes cranial anatomy in general in vertebrate animals. I'm currently focused on birds for my dissertation, and that actually started with some really good mentorship I got out of my undergraduate institution. So I did my first bird brain evolution project in undergraduate, and when you're talking about that from a paleontology perspective, we don't get to talk about neurons and neurophysiology and how different parts of the brain communicate. We only get to look at the external shape. And a good way to do it now that we have the technology is with CT scanning, which is basically like a three-dimensional X-ray. So if you think of an X-ray, you see it's just taken front to back and just in one plane, whereas a CT scan is still using X-rays, but it just goes all the way around the specimen. So you can get a three-dimensional model, and it also allows you to see inside the specimen. And if you're looking at brains, that is critical. And so that's what my project has been now. It will probably continue that way because CT scanning really has revolutionized the field. So I might move into different taxa, but continuing this question of the way behavior shapes the brain and the head in animals is where I see myself for the foreseeable future. One of the specimens that I've looked at for my dissertation work is the skull of a moa. It's an extinct giant flightless bird from New Zealand. And looking at that and comparing it to the brain endocasts of its modern day relatives, we found that actually certain regions of its brain are incredibly reduced compared to most other birds that we see alive today. And so that raises these interesting questions of how were they still able to function as birds and as participants in their environment if they have this what looks like a level of reduction that almost seems like that part of the brain wouldn't be functioning at the same level. So that's been one of the most exciting things. A big part of my project has actually been focusing on modern day species because we're trying to ground truth the approach of looking at the brain endocasts and using them as a proxy for the brain. So they look externally a lot like the brains of birds look externally, but my project is building a large extant sample because we can compare the brain endocast to the brain to make sure that it is a fair proxy so that we can then take it into the fossil record with, for example, the moa. When I took the paleontology class, when I first got turned on to this as a possibility, as a career, it was co-taught by two people, Dr. Mary Schweitzer and Dr. Dan Sepka. And Dr. Sepka approached me afterwards, and actually I think maybe I approached him afterwards after this course to ask if there were more. And then there were more that he was teaching, and those were smaller discussion-based courses. Right. And that allowed him to get to know me and see where my interests lie, and then he invited me to start doing research in his lab. And he has really remained a very important mentor in my career. I think it's important to recognize the distinction between a mentor and a role model. So, for example, Dr. Schweitzer might be a role model, seeing myself in another woman in paleontology. Because if you only see role models or just members of a certain profession that don't look anything like you, you potentially can't identify yourself as someone who could be part of that profession. But then you also have the mentoring aspect, which is a lot more active. And so Dr. Sepka at the time didn't have many students, in his lab. I think I was there, and then he had 2 other undergraduates who were he was working with, and he was able to take a really active role in us in our development as scientists. And it has really continued on even as I've been in graduate school. We are still working on projects together. So yeah, I think just someone who actually has the time to think about and invest in people in the future, and Dan is definitely one of those. In the course of my career so far, I've actually been pretty lucky. I haven't run into too many challenges based on, who I am or who I present as. I think there has been somewhat a tendency to be dismissive of who I am by potentially older men in the field. I think there were some comments about like, oh, you're wearing a dress. Like, well, yes, you're wearing pants. So I can wear a dress sometimes. But overall, I mean, there is, like casual sexism. I've been lucky to only experience minor sexual harassment in the field. It's good to see that. I would say good to see that's changing, but I think that's a very small sample. I think there are still people who do run into that. But I'm not at a point in my career where I'm having to make choices about balancing things like family and career and the demands of a career in academia or in paleontology. So I haven't run into that yet. But overall, it's been a pretty positive experience while recognizing that there are some systemic problems. I think one piece of advice is that, it is okay if you didn't grow up thinking you were going to do this, or if you, like, for example, I've never taken a geology course. Now, my research doesn't need me to, be a geologist. I need to be able to appreciate the importance of the geological context for the specimens I'm working with. But that's still something that people might look at from, students might think like, oh, but I didn't take geology, or I took it and it was not for me. That doesn't mean you can't do paleontology. Right. The same if you are coming from a geology background and you don't have biology, or that's not part of it that appeals to you, there's still room for that. That's the wonderful thing about this field, is that it really combines those fields along with other fields. A big piece of advice, I think, is to seek out good mentors, which is a hard piece of advice to give because you don't always know who the good mentors are. And so then I would follow it up with just meet as many people as you can, because in that process you will probably run into some people who are good mentors and maybe some who aren't. But if you meet as many as you can, you start to become a known entity. Volunteer to do things in your society. Even if you have the time to do it and you have the capacity, don't feel like, oh, because I'm young, I'm not supposed to co-organize a diversity luncheon, for example. That is, if you want to do it, you should be able to do it, and people are always happy to have the help. So I think just putting yourself out there and getting involved as much as you can is probably the best advice. It might not be something that needs to be said, but I think with the mentoring question, it is important to remember when we're having these discussions that, like, you can have good mentors who are men, you can have horrible mentors who are women, and even moving past those very strict definitions of, because I think this project is important. It's looking at women in paleontology, but hopefully someday as a field we can get past that. But until then, it's important to have projects like this where you do focus on what has been an underrepresented group. Good mentors are everywhere, and it's really important to celebrate those, because I think they are such an important part of increasing diversity and also retaining that diversity. It's not just about recruiting the underrepresented groups and you also have to make sure that you're recruiting them into a system that doesn't then try to wash them out.
Right.
So.
Right.